Today I'll be showing you guys how to install a set of Mazda Millenia S injectors in your 1994 Mazda MX6. The reason you would install Mazda Millenia S injectors in your car is because they flow at a higher rate of fuel than the OEM injectors do. The OEM injectors are 220 cc's versus the Mazda Millenia injectors are 280 to 290 cc's each. If you get ones after the 1999 ones, so these are like 2001 injectors, these actually flow between 300 and 315 cc's, well, between 305 and 315, so these are on 310 cc's. And then right here's a Mazda 929 injector that this is the wrong year, but if you get the right year ones, they flow around 330 cc's, but you have to make a custom harness for them. These are really only useful in a forced induction application that is turbo or supercharger, unless you have really extensive naturally aspirated mods on your engine. You're not going to need this much fuel flow. So here you can see the big benefit of why people use the Mazda Millenia S injectors. This blue one is your OEM Mazda KL engine injector, 220 cc's. Then here you have your Mazda 929 injector with the green tops. You'll notice that the plugs for the electrical connections on the OEM connectors are on top, versus with the 929s they're on the side, and the Mazda Millenias are exactly the same as the OEM, but with a higher fuel flow rate. So these will drop right into your rails and plug in just like the other ones did, without any modifications. And to my knowledge, these are the only injectors that are 100% drop-in without having to make a new fuel rail or a custom wiring harness. So to swap these injectors, the first thing you're going to have to do is pull this fuel rail. The first thing I would recommend doing is opening your fuse box cover, and inside there is a green relay. This relay right here is for your fuel pump. You're going to want to pull that and then start your car, and it should start up and then sort of stumble and die because there's no fuel pump feeding fuel to the engine anymore. The reason you're going to do this is so that it bleeds off any fuel pressure that's in the system, depressurizes the lines, so when you unhook things, fuel doesn't spray everywhere. With your fuel system depressurized, you're going to need to unhook this hose. On your car, it's going to be one hose over like that. Mine's a custom setup. But you're going to want to squeeze these and slide them up, and then wiggle these hoses off, and then you'll be able to slide your fuel rails out that side without disconnecting them, without having to take off the intake manifold. There is still a little bit of gas that just sits in the lines, so for this reason I would recommend unhooking your negative battery cable, because you don't want any type of spark that would catch your beautiful car on fire. With the fuel lines removed from this side, the fuel line in between two rails, you can go ahead and unplug the connector cap for the fuel rails by these two plugs right there. With those two plugs undone, the next thing you're going to have to unhook is the banjo bolt side of the fuel rail and the fuel return side. Yours will probably just connect straight to that, but through your fuel pressure regulator, but I have an adjustable fuel pressure regulator, so I'm going to unhook it right there. But basically now you're going to unhook the fuel lines from the fuel rails. This bolt is a 17 millimeter. The banjo bolt, once you get that out, make sure not to drop the washers that come with it. Washers, one or two, because those are copper crush washers. You should probably replace those. But the next thing we need to do is to get these fuel rails unbolted from the engine. The fuel rail is held on, each fuel rail, by two Allen key bolts. You're going to have to use an Allen key set and just undo those. There's one there, and there's one on the other side, and more. Basically, that you can get to them in between the intake runners, but you should be able to do that and get those bolts out. With all those bolts loose, I was able to just stick my hand in there and pull up on the rail, pushing against the intake manifold, and she popped right out. So now we're going to see a little bit of trouble with this bolt being able to clear, but now that that rail's loose, I'll definitely be able to have enough play for it. So there we go, and then this one should just pop out too. There we go. Okay, and now we're going to slide them that way and out of the intake manifold. Alright, let's get it out. Come on. Blow-off valve was almost in the way there. Ooh. There's a lot of fuel still in these rails. Oh no. Be sure not to lose any of the O-rings on the bottom of the fuel rails. Or the bolts themselves. The fuel rails are now out of the car. One thing I noticed as they were falling off was that underneath each one of these bolts there's a little spacer, a little plastic spacer that goes right on there, and that seems to have fallen off, so now I'm going to pick those out of the engine bay. Using a piece of wire, I was able to fish these out of the crevice down between the heads where these had all fallen. So be careful of that, and then also be careful that you don't drop any of the O-rings that go into the tops of the manifold cylinder thing there. I'm actually not going to be putting these old fuel rails back in my car. I'm going to be putting in these nice powder coated ones. But now what you're going to need to do is undo the Phillips head screws on top of these caps very carefully and remove those caps from the rails. With all the screws removed, you can remove the this fuel injector rail cap thing. With the cap removed, you can see where the fuel injectors plug in, and this is just one solid harness piece that delivers all your electrical power to your injectors. Now we're going to do the same on the other rail. With all of these screws out, you can see the beautiful tops of all of your injectors and your two injector caps, and now you're ready to pop the fuel injectors out of the rails. I'm actually leaving my injectors in this rail because they have no purpose for me because I've got new rails, but if you're going to be putting these same rails back in your car, you're going to want to, the process, so from what I've gathered, is to put a really small socket into the end of the thing and gently hit it until the injectors pop up a little bit, and then you can get a handle on it, you can wiggle it, but they have O-rings around the bottom and an O-ring on the top. I've got two O-rings, one for the rail and one for the little nozzle part. But basically you're going to pop those out and then put them into, work on putting the new injectors into your rail. So I have one injector in. Make sure that the little tab is facing the same way that it was originally. I am using a rubber mallet and gently tapping it down in there, and that seems to be working pretty well. So that is one rail done, and one rail still left to do. All 6 Millenia S injectors are ready to go back into the car after you get these caps back on top of them. With the caps back on, I painted mine a brilliant silver. You're going to go ahead and put the screws in. With all the screws back in, it's time to slide this rail back into the car. Make sure that you have all of your O-rings back in place, and make sure that these spacers for the screws are in there. Be careful not to knock them down into this canyon there. and then go ahead and slide in the rear rail. With the fuel rails back in the car, you can go ahead and hook up the hose that connects the two lines. With the hoses hooked back up, you can start attaching the other side of the rails. With both the supply and return fuel line hooked up, you can plug back in your rail. So with everything hooked back up, this has been how to install Mazda Millenia S injectors in a 1994 Mazda MX6. Thanks for watching.